little bit of a history kick.
Which I like. It's fun.
Well, it's really interesting. I have learned a ton doing research for the different shows that I didn't know. But interestingly enough, we've kind of been bouncing around. So we did D-Day, and the following week we went back 2 years in history.
Midway.
And we did Midway. So now we're going to jump back to 1944.
Okay.
And several days after the invasion of the D-Day invasions, the Normandy invasions, we invaded a small island called Saipan. And we need to throw the map up because Saipan wasn't part of the original battle plan for the taking of World War II. But technology had changed, and we're going to get into that. And Saipan is part of the Marianas Islands, and you may have heard of, most people have heard of the Battle of Saipan, relatively famous.
We all heard about the Marianas Trench and all that.
The Marianas Trench. It is the deepest point in the world. We sailed over it on one of our cruises, and like a goofball, I went out and threw a quarter in it. They said it would take a year for that quarter to reach the bottom, 7 miles down.
Would it actually ever really reach the bottom? I mean, I'm just thinking because, and I know my nerds, they're so dense. I mean, at the weight of it, at some point, it probably just stayed there.
It's just barely moving. So anyway, there were 3 islands in the Marianas chain. The northernmost was Saipan, which was the first one we took, and then Tinian, and then the island of Guam.
Right.
Which is actually the largest of the islands, and certainly the best known today, still a U.S. territory. And I didn't look that up. I don't know if Saipan and Tinian are also U.S. territories, because they list Guam as a protectorate. It is considered a protectorate of the U.S. Anyways, 1944, and we are beginning our push. So on the map, you'll see the red dot, and it's very much in the middle of nowhere. But what it is, and we'll show you a picture as we get through this, the reason we wanted to take this, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the segment. But the reason they made the change is they needed a base for our new B-29 bombers, which was the only point out there that had enough flat space to expand. We had to expand the runway the Japanese had to take that
Now, who did
island.
the expansion? Was that the Seabees or the Corps of Engineers?
Most likely it was the Seabees in that case, because it was all supported by the Navy and most of the Army. So at this point in time, believe it or not, we think of inter-service rivalries now as kind of funny. But back then, these admirals and generals would make decisions that would literally kill American troops over nothing but ego. And it really was a shame. So MacArthur controlled the islands that are to the east of the Philippines. The Philippines is in the bottom, kind of to the left of the map. There are the islands of New Guinea. And then below that, there are the Solomon Islands. The Solomon Islands is where Guadalcanal took place. We will talk about that in August as we kind of continue this trend, and we haven't quite figured out. The show's constantly morphing. Do we make this all military history? Do we talk about veteran service organizations? Any of our listeners want to chime in?
And then we
to try to create some consistency.
Theoretical ideas.
Yeah, we've got a future show that we are going to talk about because I've actually got a great presentation that Colonel Kennedy did, and we're going to talk about what's going on with our friends in China, but then we're also going to do a little what about China and Russia. So we're going to do some stuff, and that really talks about what we're going to do in the future. But for now, let's focus on history.
All right.
And it is 1944, and we have crossed the tipping point, although some people will say that by taking the islands of Saipan, we would forever... The outcome of the war was basically determined. It was just a question of how long it would take Japan to surrender, and this would be yet another example of how ferocious the Japanese fought. So if we can throw up the map of the island of Saipan, we will talk about, and this is actually the landing plan for the island, and you can see to the southwest corner of the island, the 2nd and 4th U.S. Marine Divisions and the 27th U.S. Army Division landed and created a beachhead. Now, if you look closely, you can see red kind of concave lines that stretch out for there at the very bottom, and it's probably hard to read on Facebook or YouTube, but you can see the advancement at 15 June, at 18 June, at 21 June, as they started to take the island and march north. Dead center in the middle of the island was the highest point of the island, and that was the point where the Japanese concentrated their defenses. But a couple of fascinating things that had happened. So many will remember the bloody Battle of Tarawa. It was actually a gruesome battle.
Oh, horrible.
And it was one of the battles that led to... So I'm going to do a little bit of our typical tangent, and I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about a Cajun by the name of Higgins. William G. Higgins created the Higgins boat. And I may not have his first name right, but his last name was certainly Higgins.
Yep.
And
hence
he
the
had,
name. Yeah.
He had been, he was known in Louisiana and down in the bayous and stuff, and did a lot of business with people in Florida too. But he made a flat-bottomed boat that would travel across the swamps real well. And if you know anything about the swamps, it's not all water. You run up on these little sandbars, for lack of a better term, and he had to be able to get over them, those flat-bottom boats, and literally let them slide right over them, and people could move around the swamp. And people actually lived out in the swamp and did business out in the swamp, and so he kind of serviced that. In the late 30s, a general by the name of Krulak, he was known as Brute Krulak, who would go on to do some rather famous things in World War II and in the Korean War. He was a great, gruff, typical Marine Corps general, and that's why they called him Brute Krulak. His first name was actually Victor. He would rise to the rank of 3-star general when he retired. He would never become commandant, which was the job he coveted the most. But his son, who I've actually met, he'd actually have to look up to you. He's that short. Charles Krulak's a really nice man, was a great commandant for the Marines. Anyway, thanks to Victor Krulak, the Marine Corps started talking to Mr. Higgins and explained to him what he wanted done. And the first thing they did in the traditional landing craft that you see featured heavily in movies like Saving Private Ryan were the traditional landing barge that had the ramp in the front that would drop down, and they eventually realized that was a bad idea. But at Tarawa, the landing craft got hung up on the reefs.
Did not know that.
Yeah, and that just led to a lot of Marines getting killed.
I was going to say, that cannot end well.
That was not going to end well. And they'd fall out of those, and because they'd eventually jump out of the landing craft just to get away from the Japanese fire, not realizing they were jumping into seas surrounded by blood and sharks.
Yep.
One of the things they, other than the USS Indianapolis, they don't talk about in most books. They don't talk about the damage done by sharks, but we lost quite a few guys.
I would sharks. Imagine. I mean, you think about all of the naval engagements out there, and I mean, obviously, blood and carnage all over the water. With Battle of Midway. I mean, who knows how many men on either side were swimming in the water that were probably lives taken because they were probably injured and bleeding by sharks. Probably an untold number of victims.
Absolutely.
To shark, and we would not know.
You just don't know. I mean, because they're just gone.
Yep.
Anyway, at Tarawa, they realized that they needed something to help get across the reefs. So one of the things that we did is we created, it was called an LVT, a landing vehicle tracked. And it actually had a tank-like track on the bottom of it, which would actually crawl it. Like a tank basically crawls, even when they're going really fast. The function is still a crawl. And they would crawl across the tops of the reef. So we used a tremendous number. Of course, the Japanese aren't stupid, and they adjust too. So you do something here, they do something there. So one of the things that they had done, knowing that southwest corner of Saipan was the best beach to land on, they had marked artillery flags. So the artillery spotters knew the distance once they started to range in on our troops landing. So we lost over 20 LVTs to Japanese artillery fire before these guys could ever get on the beach. It was a rather bloody contest. There were 30,000, Japanese troops, including some naval infantry and naval support people. There were 60,000 Americans who invaded. Mm-hmm. The Japanese would lose 29,000 of them. They would almost be completely typical of the Japanese.
The Japanese mentality, that warrior creed that they had, that, we will fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last anything, death before dishonor was literally.
Yeah, that was a literal thing to them.
Yeah, it wasn't just a catchphrase. Yeah. It was to go back to the emperor or to your leadership that you had to surrender was the greatest dishonor that you could do in their culture.
Yep.
Absolutely.
In fact, as we approach this segment, the end of this segment, one of the stories, so we started moving ashore. The Japanese were well dug in like they were everywhere. This goes back to the story of Midway, where had we lost the Battle of Midway, even if we eventually come back, I cannot imagine how well defended those islands would have been.
Oh, it would have been brutal.
Absolutely brutal. They were pretty dug in as it was, but for them to have a couple more years to continue, it would have been bloodier and bloodier and bloodier. And this was an absolutely brutal battle as the American troops were fighting farther and farther north. They got to Mount Tishu, I believe is how it's pronounced, and I'm not doing a very good job with that. But they got down to the point where the defenders on the island realized all hope was lost. They were completely isolated by the American ships, basically blockading the entire island. Yep. They had no hope for survival. And they basically, the commanding general basically led 3,000 remaining troops on one of the largest mass banzai charges of the war. And sadly, they wound up overrunning multiple American positions, including two entire Army battalions and the better part of a Marine battalion, until they finally literally ran out of bodies to throw in front of bullets. And it was absolutely terrible. In the next segment, we're going to talk about one of the Japanese survivors, and it's actually a fascinating story. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the strategic value of Saipan. Yep. But at that point in time, the really sad part of this that I want to leave this segment with, 7,000 Japanese civilians lost their lives as well. Now, many of them armed with nothing but spears were part of the banzai charge, but thousands of them went to Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff and threw themselves
and we've
to
all
their death.
Seen those videos and clips there. It's just, I remember seeing the video of, it's a pretty common video of a Japanese woman. She's wearing the white shirt, the blue pants, and she's got her child, her young child in hand, and her and child right off the cliff.
It is scary what propaganda will do to the human